Good afternoon. I'm Evan Karish, Duke University, and former and recovering editor of Anesthesiology. I'm chairing the session, so let me open the session and introduce our speaker. He's Evan Karish, Duke University, former and recovering editor of Anesthesiology. Thank you all for coming. I will take it by your attendance that you are still a believer in the medical literature, and I congratulate you on that. To get started, let me tell you about my disclosures. I serve on a data safety monitoring board for Vertex Pharmaceutical. It has nothing to do with reading the medical literature. There are a few things that I hope to accomplish today and that you will walk away with. One is a better understanding of how to systematically approach a published article. One is to understand the appropriate presentation of data and results, and to understand what misrepresentation looks like, and to recognize bias and spin. And that's lastly to be able to identify unreliable and reliable, hopefully, sources of information. It was interesting. A couple of weeks ago, in preparation for coming to the meeting, I went to my local pharmacy to get a flu shot. I thought that would be smart to do. So I got my flu shot, and I was chatting with the pharmacist who gave me my flu shot. And she asked me what I did. I told her, so she, of course, starts getting chatty. And she says, funny, let me tell you about the last patient that I gave a flu shot to. It was a very delightful 72-year-old guy. And I gave him the flu shot, and then he said, you know, sometimes after I get a flu shot, I feel a little bit bad, and sometimes maybe, you know, get a little febrile or a little sick or whatever, you know, what should I do? And she says, well, just take a Tylenol. And his eyes got wide and his face froze, and he said, I can't take a Tylenol. The president says that it causes autism. So this is the world that we live in. When you propose a lecture to the ASA, you have to come up with a catchy title. So my catchy title was, Can You Believe It? And I had no idea what was going to transpire in the world of science and publishing over the course of the year since I proposed that. It's you know, predictions are difficult, but boy, did I get lucky for all the wrong reasons. So I guess the first question is, what's the medical literature? Well, there are journals and there are non-journals. Journals are things like New England Journal, JAMA, British Medical Journal, Mayo Clinic Proceedings, Anesthesiology, ANA, BJA, et cetera. Those are all journals. There are things that are not a journal. TikTok is not a journal. Facebook, sorry to burst your bubble. Facebook is not a journal. YouTube is not a journal. Open Evidence is not a journal, and AI and ChatGPT is not a journal. Some sort of hard facts to understand. 80% of the authors who cite papers never read the paper that they cite. They have no idea what they're talking about. 100% of large language models, AI, have never read the papers that they cite. And there are some large language models that just create the papers out of thin air in order to cite them. As a patient, I am hoping that my practitioners are not relying on all of this information to guide their practice. So how do we create the information that we use? Well, it starts with data. And there's a progression. Data should lead to publications, preferably high quality. Publications should lead to information. That's a higher order than just publications. You know, information is the concerted, thoughtful aggregation of data in publications. It's interconnected, it's linked, it's synthesized. Information should lead to knowledge. Knowledge is a higher order than just information. Knowledge is this network of interconnected facts and beliefs and understanding and information. And it does have some uncertainty, but it's sculpted, it's synthesized, it's put together. And ideally, this all becomes wisdom. Wisdom is sometimes said to be knowledge curated by adverse events. Nonetheless, these are the hierarchy of what we have to work with. Now, publication numbers have increased exponentially in the past 100 years, but knowledge has only increased linearly, which tells us that the gap between the number of publications and the amount of valid information that they're based on continues to grow year after year after year. And that 90% of the knowledge that we have comes from only 9% of scientific productivity. And bottom line is, producing a paper is far less challenging than creating new knowledge. Getting papers published, in the grand scheme of things, is a lot easier. Now, we like to talk about sort of the hierarchy of evidence in clinical medicine. And you see this pyramid constructed, and I don't understand it because they put the most important part in the smallest triangle. It sort of should be upside down. But nonetheless, we think of clinical practice guidelines as being sort of the top of that pyramid, and that's even better than meta-analysis and systematic reviews, and those are based on clinical trials, and that's better than expert opinion and case reports. But the bottom line is that clinical practice guidelines are all based on fundamental knowledge, or at least they should be. And if all of that knowledge is not correct, the clinical practice guidelines are not going to be correct. And the synthetic methods of generating these summative articles can't separate fact from fiction. They just scrape the internet. That's all. So who's got the time to do all this? Right? There's 50,000 journals. There's 119,000 journal articles that are published every week. 6 million a year. How many of us have read all 6 million every year? Raise your hand. Yeah. Just in anesthesiology alone, there's more than 40,000 articles published every year now. This is just daunting. Absolutely daunting. And it's difficult to keep up. But we have to read. And so why do we do, what do we read for? What are the reasons? Well, understanding pathobiology, understanding science, understanding clinical decision-making, understanding what causes what we see, learning about disease, manifestation, symptomatology, finding out about new methodologies, new drugs, new approaches, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what should we do, what should we use, what shouldn't we do and use, how do we sort out the claims of advertising. For those of you that watch television, you've probably seen advertisements for drugs again and again. How do we sort out all of those medical advertising claims? How do we find out how key opinion leaders approach issues, problems, and recommend interventions and therapies? Keeping track of news, if you will. And then there's like impressing others. You want a little bit of information to use at cocktail parties and impress your friends and new friends. And lastly, they always say that some people read journals. For those of us that still have and get and read journals, some people read them front to back, and other people read them back to front, because the editors and the letters to the editors and the snarky responses are always in the back, and that's the most entertaining part. So I like to think that we should approach reading a manuscript with some kind of a mindset, right? If you're playing a sport, you come up to the golf ball on the tee with a certain mindset. You're going to play baseball, you come to the plate, you have a certain mindset. And there's all different kinds of mindsets. One is, I'm going to read because everything's going to change my practice. Some people may believe everything they read. Some people think, well, I read it in the paper, therefore it's got to be true, right? It's published. Then there's the, trust, but verify. A little bit of skepticism. A little bit more skeptical is, well, prove it to me. Then I'll believe it. Or the super cynic, and that is, you can't believe anything you read. Part of this depends on the source as well. Some sources are more trustable than others. So I think there's a balance between trust and distrust, and maybe skepticism sits somewhere in the middle. But to me, the most important part is thinking and evaluating critically. We should all be critical readers. Now, my bias, and I'll put it up front, is that I think that peer review matters. Who are you going to trust, right? So I look at an article, and first thing I want to know is it peer reviewed? And was it peer reviewed seriously? Or was it, kind of peer reviewed? We looked at it, and then we published it. Or was there no peer review? And I don't put a lot of stock, personally, in things that aren't peer reviewed. Peer review is not the be-all and end-all. As I'll tell you, it's not a guarantee. But I think that it is a filter, and I think it is important. And I think it's important for a number of reasons. And I wrote an editorial about this because the editorial board and I believe strongly. We saw articles that came into the journal, and we saw them as they were published, and we know the delta between what came in and what get published. The readers of the journal only see what gets published. So I got to appreciate just how valuable the peer review process was in improving the quality of what got published in anesthesiology. It can improve the presentation, it can improve the quality, it can improve clarity, it can identify errors, and sometimes those errors are so great that this is just not going to make it over the bar, doesn't deserve publication. It can help with the interpretation. Sometimes there was great data, and it was really well interpreted. But sometimes we saw data that was really good, but misinterpreted, and we helped guide the authors to a better interpretation. Peer review can temper over-enthusiastic authors. Now, don't tell somebody that their baby's not pretty. But nonetheless, authors, it's very easy as an author to fall in love with your own data. I'm guilty of that, right? We all think it's great. Well, sometimes it's good to have those enthusiastic perspectives tempered a little bit. Sometimes peer review will pick up on scientific misconduct, and if it does, that's a good thing. And I think very importantly, peer review grounds the public trust. And I should put public trust in capital letters, because at the end of the day, everything that we do is based on the public trust. The public trusts their physicians. They trust their practitioners. They want to trust scientists. The government gives a lot of money every year for doing research, and they do so because of the public trust. So we hold that public trust to be very important. And frankly, patients have told us that they believe peer review is important. Now, it's been challenged a little bit in the past year or so, but nonetheless, historically, that's the public perception. Now, peer review is not a guarantee of the truth, right? It does not say that this is perfect. It doesn't guarantee that it's true, but it's better than the alternative. It's a nice article that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy. National Academy of Sciences is sort of like the Supreme Court, you should pardon the expression, of science. It is the highest that we have. And they said, the public does recognize the importance of peer review and scientific findings. When you read articles in the New York Times or newspaper, they very frequently will refer to a paper as being peer-reviewed because the public recognizes that peer review is a meaningful stamp. And the role of journals is to execute peer review. So 3 things that I think about in reading an article: the science and the rigor. The second is the writing and the presentation. And the third is the integrity. 3 things. A well-written article is not a guarantee that the science is credible, but I think the opposite is true. A poorly written article does not generate confidence in the quality of the information. Publication is not a matter of truth. For those of you that have tried to get a paper published, you will understand that publication is a metric of persistence. It's not necessarily a metric of quality. And so how are you going to approach a paper? And there's a lot of different ways, and I'll sort of portray this in a couple of them. One is sort of what I call the toe in the water, and that is you read the last line in the abstract conclusion. How many of you just read the last line in the abstract conclusion? Oh, fess up. Thank you. It happens. It's sort of what I call, it's like dine and dash, right? Just cut to the chase. I want to look at the bottom line, and I'm going to move on from there. And I'm going to trust everything else. Then there's a little bit more in depth. It's wading in, if you will. You look at the title. Maybe you'll look at that nice little 2-sentence summary in the table of contents. Maybe you'll read there's a box on the first page of the article that says, what did we know before this article? What's new? What does this tell us? Type thing. Sometimes there's a visual abstract, which is a cartoon to try and summarize the findings. And if you're really brave, you make it all the way through to the abstract of the article. And that's a wading in approach, if you will. If you want to dive in, that's a little bit more. You read the title and the abstract, and you're going to read the introduction and the methods and the results and the conclusions. And that's a lot to read. And if you want to go all in and read everything start to finish, it's the titles. Look at the authors and the authorship. If you're reading an article about a clinical trial of an anesthetic, and there are 15 authors, and 2 of them are anesthesiologists, and 13 of them are orthopods, what is that going to tell you? Nothing against orthopods. Some of my best orthopods are orthopods. What about the funding and any conflicts of interest? Read the table of contents summary, the highlights. You look at the premise of the article, the introduction, the why, the purpose. You look at the methods. Was this well done? Is there a hypothesis? Was there no hypothesis? What about the methods? Was it well designed, well executed? Did they do what they said they were going to do? How about the results? And then the conclusions. And look at the figures and tables as well. Actually look at the data. This is in-depth evaluation of an article. We're not all going to have time to do this on all 6 million articles published every year. But if you want to really thoroughly understand, this is sort of the ground state. Now, this flowchart's a little bit tough to read. I like it because it was published in 1981, and it's every bit as true today as it was in 1981. And it says, yeah, do a few things first, right? Look at the title, look at the authors, look at the summary, and do you care about any of those things? And the answer is no, go on to the next thing. If the answer is yes, well, figure out why you're going to read the article. What's your goal? What do you want to get out of what it is that you are about to read? And once you figure that out, well, then go ahead and read the article. And then the question is, can you trust it? Right? So this is a conversation we're having about trust and not trust. And I'm going to sort of talk about both. Well, what are some things that you might want to look for? Well, is the study fake to begin with? What about the methodology? Is it the right methodology? Can you understand what was done? Does it make sense to you? Is there any data? Is there enough data? Is there too little data? Did they analyze the data correctly? Are the conclusions justified by the data? And this is key, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that concept. And then lastly, what does the article say compared to what the authors tell you it says? And sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes they're miles apart. And frankly, evaluating the medical literature is a critical skill. We all work very hard to develop critical skills. And I think reading the literature is a critical skill. So here's some things which I think are important. One is, look at the title. In reality, the title may be the only part of an entire article that somebody may read. So the title should be good. It should be descriptive, and it shouldn't mince words. The abstract very often is the only part of an article that is read. It should be standalone. It should communicate all the elements that are important and tell you in about 12 to 15 sentences the essence of the article. What kind of an article is it? Is it describing an original research study? Is it describing prospective research, retrospective research? Is it a review, a summative article? Is it a guideline, a clinical practice guideline? Is it a consensus statement? Those two things are very different. Is it sort of a decision analysis? There's a whole host of different kinds of articles, so you want to keep in mind what it is that you're about to read, because they're all written for different purposes. If it has outcome measures, what are those outcome measures? You know, is this just pure science? Is this something which is a very patient-centric article? Are they talking about clinical utility? Is this study being done for regulatory approval? Very often we will read the first things that get published about a new drug or the studies that were done for regulatory approval. Is the paper well written? Now, there are currently guidelines. There's an organization called the Equator Network, stands for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research. They now, as of yesterday, have 688 guidelines on how to write different kinds of manuscripts. And authors do and should consult these all the time. Journals very often will use the Equator guideline in assessing and peer reviewing a manuscript, because this is a way of hopefully guaranteeing some degree of uniformity, but most importantly, quality. What do you look for in the introduction? Right? These are 500 to 750 words as an introduction to the paper. Why did we do this? What's the premise? What's the reason behind it? What did we know? What do we need to know? What's the purpose of the study? Is there a hypothesis? Is that hypothesis well laid out? Does the hypothesis relate to the unmet need and the information that we don't have, but we need to know? Is there a good research question in this, or is this simply a voyage to see what's on the bottom? A key sentence which I always looked for is a statement, "It is not known that." Often that means it's a voyage to see what's on the bottom. Right? Just because it's not known doesn't mean it's worth knowing. What about the research question? Is there a research question? Is it a good question? Is it a relevant question? Is it relevant to me and my practice? Is it original, or was this a question that somebody asked 30 years ago and got answered already? What's the knowledge gap, if you will? That's a key phrase. What's the unmet need? That's another key phrase. And that whole introduction should end with a hypothesis and a purpose. The goal of this study was to do X, Y, and Z. Different kinds of research questions, qualitative questions, quantitative questions. You know, qualitative question is, tell me about the vomiting experience after anesthesia. How did you feel about that? Quantitative question is, how many people threw up after anesthesia? Another quantitative question is, well, if we compare drug A to drug B, how many people threw up in each group? And there's another way of organizing this. It's called the PICO method. The population, the intervention, the comparator, the outcome, and the time frame. You don't necessarily have to follow that, but that is a recognized way of presenting information. You should look at the methods, right? Because somebody's going to launch off an investigation and they should tell you what they did and how they did it. The sine qua non of a good method section is that somebody else can come along and repeat the study. That's the best there is. Did the study have ethics approval, IRB approval, or animal care approval? If it was a clinical trial, was it registered in a recognized clinical trials registry? These days, the first thing that a reviewer does when they get a paper to review is to look up the registry and see if the paper methods matched the registry, or was there some switching there? Was there appropriate blinding and randomization, or was it non-randomized? But did they tell you? Were the methods correct, and were the methods appropriate to be able to answer the question that's being asked? Were the methods correctly performed? Did they tell you who the population was? Did they tell you when the study was done, where it was done? Is the study inclusion and exclusion criteria appropriate and justified? They tell you what the outcome measures were, and were they appropriate? If it was observational, was there a data plan? And I'll talk more about that. And then, were the statistics correct? And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Now, when we talk about outcomes, there's primary outcomes and secondary outcomes. Now, the thing about primary outcomes is that they're primary, and you get one of them. The primary outcome is the most important question that you set out to answer. And the whole study should be designed around the primary outcome. The secondary outcomes are all the other things that you wanted to learn, but they're not quite as important as the primary outcome. In theory, you should have one primary outcome, and it sort of holds the paper together. Secondary outcomes, you can have many secondary outcomes. They may be similar to or different from the primary outcome. Sometimes you may look at an intervention, but a secondary outcome could be the safety, it could be the adverse events, it could be long-term follow-up. Your primary outcome is what happened after 30 days, and the secondary outcome is what happened after a year. And there's lots of different kinds of outcomes. You can have a patient-centric outcome. You can have a singular outcome, you can have a composite outcome, or a surrogate outcome. And on the bottom of the slide, I've given you some examples of what a patient-centered outcome would look like, or a composite outcome would look like, or a surrogate outcome would look like. So let's say you want to do an asthma study. Well, the patient-centered outcome is, how is your asthma? A composite outcome would be, well, what's a 20% decrease in hospitalizations, or 20% difference in asthma control together? A surrogate outcome would be pulmonary function testing, right? Patients don't care about their PFTs, they care about how they feel. A very different kind of an outcome. After surgery, patient-centered outcome would be return to work, or days alive out of the ICU. A composite outcome would be major adverse cardiac events, and a surrogate component outcome would simply be troponin postoperatively, right? So beware of what we call shotgun approaches, too many outcomes, right? We're just going to shoot the gunshot and hope that one of the pellets hits. Homegrown outcomes, if you will. There's lots and lots of metrics and outcomes now standardized for perioperative medicine. Were they appropriately used, or did somebody make up their own measures? Now, composite outcomes are increasingly used in perioperative medicine. A composite outcome is exactly what it is. It's used as a primary outcome, but it's composed of multiple outcomes. Probably one of the more common composite outcomes is what we call major adverse cardiovascular events. And that's a combination of cardiovascular death, a non-fatal MI, stroke, or acute injury or hospitalization for angina or the need for coronary revascularization, major adverse cardiac events. Now, there's a reason that composite outcomes are increasingly popular. One is it's easier to show a statistical difference in an intervention because you can pick from among many of those outcomes. Statistically, it's easier. It's a tougher analysis, but in the long run, it's easier to show an effect, if you will. It can be a little tough to interpret the results. If any one of those things in the composite shows to be significantly different, then your whole composite can be significantly different, even if all the others were equivocal. Sometimes the thing that turns the p-value positive, if you will, isn't the most important outcome. And so you want to look at that appropriately. When it comes to observational studies, and I'll just say in the old days, the idea was, well, we're going to do a chart review and we're going to look at it a million different ways until we find something that generates a p-value, we'll declare a victory and publish. Okay? That's not the way to do observational research. Observational research can be very well done and very important, but you should decide, first of all, what data is needed, how you're going to analyze the data, not what we call a data-driven analysis, which is a polite way of what we really call a data dredge, right? We're going to dredge through all the data until we find something that we can publish. Now, sometimes you learn something in studies that you didn't expect to find, and that's perfectly fine, and that's really cool. There's nothing wrong with finding out things that you didn't plan to find out. So a post hoc analysis is perfectly okay, but you should just disclose it in a paper, right? Data presentation. What did the authors show you? When was the study done? Where was it done? What was the population? What was the primary outcome? What were the secondary outcomes? Were there any post hoc analyses? Did they tell you how they dealt with missing data? I've done a lot of studies, and missing data happens. Perfectly okay. How did the authors deal with it? Right? Is it incorporated in the analysis? Did they replace the patient that didn't show up for a test? It's fine, perfectly fine to happen. Just tell us about it. Do the numbers add up? Did they show you error bars? Did they tell you what the error bars mean? Standard error, standard deviation. Can you connect the results to the study that was done and the methods? And did they show you the right data? Did they show you the primary outcome first, then show you the secondary outcomes? Are all the figures and tables cited in the text, in the right order? Are they adequately described? Are the graphs and images well done and clearly presented? I would encourage you to actually read the data. Don't just look at the bottom line. Right? Thank you for chuckling. Was the sample size justified? We looked at 100 patients. We looked at 1,000. We looked at 10,000. Is that the right number? Was there a good data analysis plan? Or was this whole thing analyzed after all the data was looked at? Some key things to look at. The size of a difference between two groups. Strength of associations. There's a difference between a statistical significance and a clinically meaningful difference. The larger the N in any study, the higher the likelihood that you will be able to show a statistically significant difference between two different interventions. It doesn't mean that that difference is clinically meaningful. We've established things like pain scores. We've said that a meaningful difference in a pain score is a certain number of units of improvement, not just a difference between 4.10 and 4.12 on a 10-point scale. What about statistics? Were there statistics? Were the right statistics used? Are statistics revealing things, or are they covering things? And were they done correctly? P-values are important. Worshipping in the house of p-values is not good to do. P-values says that there's a 1 in 20 chance that you're inappropriately rejecting a null hypothesis. It doesn't tell you the statistical likelihood of truth. It doesn't tell you the statistical likelihood of untruth. The p-value of 0.05 is a completely arbitrary number. It goes back to the 1800s. It's one that's commonly used, but the difference between a p-value of 0.05 and 0.049 is not the difference between truth and non-truth. It's not the difference between effect and non-effect. If there's not a significant p-value, that doesn't mean there was a trend. You know, a trend is what people want to believe, not what they found. And beware of what we call p-hacking. P-hacking is the same thing as data dredging, right? We're going to grind on this data in the statistics machine until a p-value magically falls out the bottom, and we can declare victory and publish. You know, the long-term definition of p-hacking is exploiting data analysis in order to identify patterns which would be presented as statistically significant when in fact there's no there there. Simon Gelman, one of the members of the greatest generation in anesthesiology, liked to say in a lovely Russian accent, which I'm not going to try and do, if you torture data long enough, they will confess. Now, there's actually a literature on p-values. They looked at 30 years of studies, almost 600,000 randomized clinical trials, and 8.6 of them had phrases in there to describe almost significant p-values. Right? So the small percentage in that green zone had a p-value less than 0.05. The vast majority of papers had p-values between 0.05 and 0.1, not statistically significant. Well, it's not going to get you your Nobel Prize, and it's not going to get you promoted. So what do? Well, you come up with very creative language to describe almost significant. You know, the data were marginally significant. They were all but significant. Well, there was a non-significant trend. And I'm proud to say that in the years that I was editor of anesthesiology, not one paper ever got published with the word trend in it. A trend is what you wanted to believe and what you want your readers to believe and nothing more. And there's a whole lexicon of how to tell people what didn't happen but you wanted to have happen. Watch out for what we call multiple comparisons. And that is, you want to look at a whole bunch of things and you start comparing one against the other. And you do it with what's called a paired comparison. Now, paired comparisons work for paired data. They don't work for multiple comparisons. If at the p less than 0.05 level, if you compare 100 things, 99.4% of the time, you're going to find something with a p-value in it. And it ain't true. So for example, clinical study, we're going to compare sleep-a-fall versus Vaporthane, right? And our outcomes were time to squeeze a hand, time to open the eyes, time to state your name, time to PACU arrival, time for PACU ready for discharge, time for actual PACU discharge, PACU pain scores, opioid use, sedation, PONV, et cetera. Well, you start comparing all of those with sets of p-values in t-tests, sooner or later, a p-value will magically appear, you declare victory, publish your paper, and hope to get promoted. The more outcomes you compare without using the right statistics, the more likelihood you are to find a p-value which says things were significant, but they weren't. What about correlations? Common method of analysis. We compare A versus B in a correlation analysis. A good regression model or correlation analysis is shown on the left. And I will tell you that every one of these data sets, when analyzed by linear regression, gives exactly the same line. It doesn't mean that that line adequately describes the data. You can extrapolate beyond the data, and that's uncool. You may have what's called a leverage value, where there's absolutely no relationship between X and Y there, but if you stick a data point out far enough away, you can force a line through those data. You may have the wrong model. Clearly, that is not a linear relationship in the upper right-hand corner, and then sometimes you may have an outlier. And the question is, what do you do with the outlier? Well, some people will simply take out the whiteout and remove the outlier and say, well, it's an outlier, so we took it out of the data set. Uncool to do. Now, typical example on the far right-hand side, you can draw a line through all of those dots, but that's the wrong model. The right model is that curved model. Watch out for data tricks. So on the left is a study comparing drug A and drug B, looking at post-op pain. And you can see the pain scores, and on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, there was no significant difference between the pain scores between drug A and drug B. Well, there's two consequences. A, the stockholders are not happy with the company which developed the drug, and this is not going to get you your Nobel Prize or promoted. So there's a trick that you do. And instead of comparing this day by day, you measure the area under the curve, because it's a lot easier to find a difference if you compute the area under the curve. So here, the area under the curve of those two data sets is statistically significant. And now you conclude that drug B results in less pain than drug A. I will posit that the average patient doesn't care about their area under the curve. They care about how they felt on post-op day 1. Now, there's another trick you can play, and that's conflating the duration of measurement to the duration of effect. Right? So we designed a clinical study to measure 0 to 96-hour pain. Valid approach. And this is what we found. Right? So the placebo is in green and the drug is in pink, and the area under the curves are different. And because you said our outcome is 0 to 96-hour pain, you can conclude that the drug results in less pain for 96 hours after surgery. But if you look at the individual time points, the only one that was significant was post-op day 0. Okay? The claim, in a sense, is true, but the claim is actually misleading. Beware of something called outcome switching, also known as formulating the hypothesis after the results, or harking, hypothesis after the results are known. You know, we did a clinical trial. The question is, does drug X lower post-op pain after 12 months? So you do the whole study, you analyze the data, and there was no difference after 12 months. Well, this is not going to get you promoted. It's not going to get you your Nobel Prize. So you go back through all the data, and you analyze it month by month. And lo and behold, you find out that at month 6, there was a difference. So you redefine the study outcome and say, our goal was to measure pain after 6 months, and now you can declare a significant p-value and publish and claim your Nobel Prize. It's kind of like you shoot the arrow and then you draw the bullseye. Another real-world example, data tricks. The published protocol for a study says it's a multi-center randomized trial comparing liposomal bupivacaine for post-op pain after total knee arthroscopy. And that was the published a priori protocol. And then you look at the published article, and it says local infiltration with Liposomal bupivacaine improves pain scores, reduces opioid use, results of a double-blind randomized trial. Well, okay, well, that's interesting. Let's read on. Well, here's the clinical trial. Patients having their knee replaced and infiltration with bupivacaine alone or bupivacaine plus liposomal bupivacaine. Simple, straightforward. And they had what they called co-primary endpoints. One was the area under the curve, 12 to 48 hours, and the other was 0 to 48 hour opioid use. And they said that we will only test opioid use if the pain result was different. And this is well designed. We did what we call two-sided t-tests, meaning could it get better or could it get worse? And because we had two outcomes, by the rules, we have to take the p-value of 0.05 and divide it in half because we're looking at two outcomes. So now the significant p-value is p less than 0.025. This is extremely well designed. That's the right thing to do. Well, you look at the study. Well, the study analysis is well because we were really looking at reductions in pain, not potential increases in pain. We did a one-sided t-test, not a two-sided t-test, which means you only have to be half as good. Well, they published the results and they said, well, the area under the curve with one intervention versus another had a p-value of 0.038. And they said, well, it's less than 0.05. Therefore, they said the drug was better. And they said opioid use was less as well. And they declared victory and said, this is a clinical trial success, the drug works. Well, not so fast, right? They did a one-sided test, but they said the real correct test was a two-sided test. They said we have to beat 0.025, but by doing a one-sided test, we only had to do 0.05. And their p-value was really a p-value of 0.076 in the world of a two-sided test, and that was not less than 0.05. And their primary outcome wasn't met, so they never even should have compared opioid use. This is the card up the sleeve. What about the discussion section, right? What does this study mean, right? What's the take-home message? Well, a well-written discussion section should restate the hypothesis, very quickly summarize the results, and tell you what it meant. It should discuss the primary outcome before the secondary outcome. It shouldn't describe the secondary outcomes that were their favorites, the ones that had a p-value that worked for them compared to the ones that didn't work. Were the conclusions supported by the data? And then they should tell you how the results fit with prior knowledge. What should a practitioner do with the results? Are there limitations to the study? There's no such thing as a perfect study. And maybe they should even tell you where to go from here. My bias is that a statement in the last line of a discussion section that says more research is needed, my thought bubble is, give me money. Right? More research is needed is not a conclusion. It's a plea for more money. Belongs not in a discussion section. And is it devoid of bias? So, some of the things you may see, is the discussion section too long? Does it go on and on and on and rant and rant? Is it just another literature review? Is it a repeat of the introduction? Does it just emphasize the positive findings, right? Does it present the secondary outcomes before the primary outcomes because the secondary outcomes generated a p-value? Is there harking, right? Did they change the targets, if you will? Is there lots of ramblings having nothing to do with the study at all? Unsupported conclusions, speculation, and spin. Spin is something you should really look out for. Spin is reporting or statements that mislead the reader, misrepresent the results of the study. And this is basically mind control. Specific reporting strategies that will highlight something that they want you to take away with, or to distract you, if you will, from the meaning of a study. Spin strategy distorts the results, distort misleading conclusions. You may see a disconnect between the results and conclusions. They'll give you all sorts of conclusions, but you go, oh, wait a minute, where does that come from? They may attribute causality when there's purely association. That's very commonly done. Or there's over-interpretation. there are all different kinds of spin. Non-significant results that are said to be significant, non-significant results that showed a trend. They don't report adverse events in a study. There may be recommendations, clinical recommendations that aren't supported by the data. They may omit things from the reporting. There may be lots and lots of hand-waving to explain away phenomenon that, don't look here, right? Look over here. Or an overly optimistic abstract, if you will. Very often we see spin in abstracts, and it's in that last line of the abstract, for those of you that raised your hands, honestly. Where do we find spin? Most of the time, spin is found in the abstract and in the discussion. And the most common kind of spin is presenting non-significance as an equivalence, which is to say, we compared A, we compared B, they weren't significantly different, therefore they are the same. That is not true. It just means that they weren't different. It doesn't mean that they were the same. And then the most common kind is to highlight the secondary outcome. Primary outcome didn't show a difference, but we found one of the secondary outcomes that did, so we're going to ride that horse. So I'll give you a nice example. This was a study of perioperative gabapentin, and they looked at pain and opioid use. And it was well-designed, randomized, double-blind, active, placebo-controlled, gabapentin compared to an active placebo, lorazepam. Because gabapentin makes people sleepy, so you couldn't blind patients, really. You had to give them an active placebo, so everybody got sleepy, so they didn't know if they got gabapentin or not. And they looked at a whole bunch of outcomes. Really well designed. They looked at the primary outcome, which was the time to pain cessation. And there was no difference in the time to pain cessation. And they looked at a bunch of secondary outcomes. The time to opioid cessation, pain at 6 months, pain at 12 months, using opioids at 6 months and using opioids at 12 months. Really well designed outcomes. And then what did they say? These are the conclusions. This was in the discussion section. They said perioperative gabapentin had no effect on postoperative pain resolution. And that's right, because the p-value was 0.73, no difference. And then they said, but it had a modest effect on promoting opioid cessation after surgery. Well, no, it didn't. The p-value was equal to 0.05. It was not less than 0.05, and that was the predefined definition of a difference. And they said gabapentin may promote opioid cessation. Well, no, it didn't. There was no difference. It said that gabapentin may prevent chronic opioid use after surgery. No, it didn't. There was no difference. And it said it may promote chronic opioid use. And no, it didn't do that either. This was published in JAMA. Spin. What about the journal that must be believed? I'm going to pick on them too. This was a study looking at back surgery, decompression with or without a fusion. And this is right out of the abstract. Randomized clinical trial looking at decompression alone versus decompression with a fusion. And the outcome was a disability index score, and the result was that there was no difference in the disability score whether your back surgery did or did not have a fusion. And then you look at the conclusions. Decompression alone was non-inferior to decompression with instrumental fusion. That's right. There was no difference. And then it says reoperation occurred somewhat more often in the decompression alone group. Huh? Well, read the paper. Right? How does this fit with the results? There's nothing in the results that says anything about reoperation. Well, you read the paper, right? And first of all, where's the data in the abstract? Everything in the conclusions should be in the results. But in the results section in the paper, it talks about the secondary outcomes, and it says they were not adjusted for multiple comparisons, i.e., we can dredge the data with an infinite number of t-tests, and no definitive conclusions can be drawn. But there's a conclusion in the abstract conclusion. So read carefully, spin. And the citations. They're the last in the paper, but they're not necessarily the least important. They should be accurate. A quarter of all the citations in papers we read are inaccurate. Very often, what they say they quote wasn't in the paper that they quote. More often than not, the authors never even read the paper. Sometimes they play telephone, right? So you quote an article, which quoted an article, which quoted an article, and by the time you get back to the original article, not only does it sometimes it doesn't say what this paper claimed, and sometimes it's something completely different, right? And 70% of what is cited in articles was only contained in the abstract. The people that are citing these things didn't read the paper. They looked at the abstract, said, oh, this is good, I'll put this in my paper. And then the last thing is integrity, right? Integrity is important. Are the authors meritorious of being authors? Is it the right authors? Is it the right number of authors? Is there gift, guest, or ghost authorship, what we call gratuitous authorship? Did we pay somebody off by putting their name on a paper, if you will? Is there appropriate disclosure of conflicts of interest and funding? Do you know who funded the research? Were the conflicts of interest appropriately managed? Are there disclosures? Was there ethical review? Is this a duplicate publication? Is it a salami publication? That is, we did a study, we looked at 10 things, so we published 10 different papers in 10 different places. That is not cool to do. Or was this paper sent to a bunch of different journals, hoping that at least one of them will accept it, and it gets published multiple times? So we live in some troubled times. Industry involvement can be a confounder in research. I'm not anti-industry. I've collaborated with industry for 4 decades. Industry-sponsored research is not necessarily bad, but one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that we hold them to the appropriate standards. 600 randomized trials. There was a study done in JAMA. 68% of them were funded by industry. Half of them were funded exclusively by industry. And that's okay. Their job is to get their drug to market or get it approved or get it accepted. 89% of industry-funded trials, funny, had outcomes that were beneficial to the industry product. 98% of non-randomized industry-funded trials had an outcome that was favorable to the industry product. So industry involvement in clinical trials is prominent for funding, for the inclusion of the authors, and the data analysis. Who did the data analysis in an industry-sponsored trial? So keep that in mind as you read. The other problem is we're seeing bad science. Bad science is becoming big business. Fraud is becoming increasingly common. There's an arms race in publishing. You've all heard about publish or perish, and this is a problem. The for-profit publishing industry is motivated by publishing more and more papers. They may or may not care about what the papers say. Their metric is making money on publishing papers. The number of scientific articles doubles every 15 years. The number of fraudulent articles has been doubling every 1.5 years. Scientific fraud is a growth industry. If you look on the right-hand side, there's a graph there from The Economist, one of my favorite scientific journals. That red line is the growth in scientific fraud. This is not good. And the consequence is compromised research integrity, quality, reputation, progress, and I come back to the public trust. What about AI and large language models? Well, the use of large language models in publishing is exploding. It's been estimated that 1/4 of publications have now been written by large language models. Those large language models are nothing more than internet scrapers. They may have value, right? right? They may, if you write an article in Spanish, but you want to publish it in English, it can help you translate your paper. Maybe it'll improve the grammar. Maybe it'll improve your summary. But large language models make false claims. They sound very authoritative and convincing. They formulate inaccurate summaries. They create biases. They're simply based on a training data set and depends on what you train them with. They make it up. They do what's called hallucinate, right? You ask them for something, it will give you that. And if it can base it on fact, it will. And if it can base it on whatever it wants to make up, it will. It will freely plagiarize. And it can't take responsibility for its own actions. One of the most famous episodes in AI was this figure that was published in a journal last year. This is the famous rat with a giant penis and 4 testicles. This was a figure that was generated by AI. And just to show you that I like to pick on everybody, this article was peer-reviewed before it was published. But it was an AI-generated image, at least we think. And it was retracted because it was false and fabricated. AI is getting really good. These are some fake microscopy images. On the top row are things like nano puffs, nano Cheetos, nano dragon's teeth. Okay? This is all fabricated. But the fabrications are getting really good. The middle row is a bunch of real images from real nanotechnology. And the next row down is fake images created by AI. I can't tell the difference, and neither can most people. It's an interesting study, unraveling the neurological mechanisms of telepathic communication, published in a journal. Right? So how did they do the experiment? Well, they got 2 people in a room and a machine with a bunch of wires, and they were communicating telepathically. And this article generated some really very authoritative-looking data, right? Squiggly lines in different colors and spectrograms of neural activity that got published. And then it got retracted because it was entirely fake. It was written by a science journalist using ChatGPT who wanted to see if he could get this fakery through the peer review system in publishing, and he did. What about an interesting case report of Ectopia cordis interna? A case report of a very rare phenomenon where the heart is missing from the chest, but it's found in the abdomen. It's said to be, it's called Tin Man syndrome, because if you remember from The Wizard of Oz, the Tin Man had no heart, right? It's also known as entirely fake because it was entirely fake, but somebody got it published. Well, the world of scholarly publishing is changing. In what I like to call the old days, conventional publishing, we had a reader pays model. That is, you publish a paper and the reader pays to read the paper, often through a subscription, often because a library subscribes to the journal and you get to read it. Well, there's been a transformation, and now we've moved in a lot of ways to what we call open access publishing. And now the change is not that the reader pays, but the author pays. You pay $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 to get your paper published. Well, if you're a publisher, the more you publish, the more money you make. So you know how big a filter they're going to use on what they publish. Or you move to preprints. Get away from publishing entirely. Preprints are nothing more than websites that post stuff that people send in. Some stuff is good and some stuff is not so good. Then you got to worry about 2 things. One of them is paper mills, and the other is what we call predatory journals. Now, paper mills are exactly what they say. These are businesses that create papers out of thin air. These are cartels that will create papers out of thin air. They will then sell you the authorship on that paper. And that authorship can be bought for a few hundred or a few $1,000s. Sometimes they'll even guarantee that the article will be published. Sometimes they'll create it, get it accepted, and then sell the authorship as guaranteed acceptance. This is not good. There's also what we call predatory journals. Predatory journals are journals that are out for the money. First, last, and always. Don't care about the content. This is fake news. They're going to make money from what we call article publication charges. That is, you're an author, you send in your manuscript, and if they accept it, you pay them $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, $15,000. This is very good for the publishing business. The profit margin in the contemporary publishing business is 30 to 40%. For those of you that want to invest your IRA in a profit-making business, for-profit publishing is a good place these days. The problem is the problem. So, you know, be curious, but also be critical, right? So there's nothing wrong with being critical. Being critical is good. If you didn't care, you wouldn't be critical. Being critical means that you care. So, you know, remember, it's the scientific rigor, it's the writing of the article, and it's the scientific integrity. Well-written articles, no guarantee that the science is credible, but a poorly written article is a warning sign. Publication doesn't mean it's not a guarantee of truth. It's a measure of persistence, and I would simply encourage you to read critically. So there's an old Russian proverb that says, "Doverye, no proverye." Trust, but verify. So thank you for your attention. If anybody's got any questions and wants to hang out, I'm happy to answer questions. I think this is the last session of the day. Question?
Thanks. So with the HARC, like whenever you're reviewing articles for publication, do you get that initial and then later on they send you the final? Or, because how would you know? So
Well,
you don't get to know if they send the final at the 6 month because that was the cutoff where they got that P.
Well, when you're reviewing an article, you get the manuscript. You get the manuscript to review. You make comments. A good journal, after all the reviewers' comments come back, they should tell you, A, was it accepted or not accepted, or accepted with revision, and hopefully give you your comments back as well as the comments of the other reviewers, so you get feedback around how you evaluated something compared to how something else got evaluated. Unless you go and look for the article after it's been published, you have no way of knowing as a reviewer what the final product looked like compared to the initial product. As an editor, I knew because I handled them all, but as a reader, you never see what an submitted product. As a reviewer, you have to go look for the final product.
So my question is, you as the editor, do you get those two, like the manuscript and then the final?
As an editor, I do.
Okay.
Okay. As a reviewer, you don't.
Okay.
You have to go look for that published version, if you will. Okay. Some of us are disciplined enough to do that. Not all of us are.
Okay.
Yeah. Question.
In terms of defining transparency, I tend to think that there's more transparency shown when they have the full dot plot of any graphic there. Why is that not the standard, as well as full data of all federally funded research available to everybody?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will tell you that different journals may differ. So for example, when I was the editor, let's say we saw data that was bar graphs, okay? Well, if there were less than X number of N in that bar graph, we said, show us the individual dots, if you will. Most articles, you are limited to the number of figures and tables that you can put in the article. You can sometimes put more figures and tables in the supplement, and sometimes that happens. There are no federal requirements around data reporting, and I think that might be hard to craft. So some of this depends on the individual journal, but I agree with you in general. The phrase that we liked to use when I was the editor, we wanted to enable the reader to get as close to the data as possible, right? Don't just show us the bottom line, show us more about how you got there. It's like in high school, you work the math problem, show your work, if you will. Question.
Hi. We all know how social media and the like, the effect it had on the information and credibility of information. These paper mills and these predatory publishers, how do you foresee the effects of their entrance in science on the credibility of any publication in the future and our credibility as scientists in the community?
That's a really good question. In 2 words, I'm concerned. In more words, I'll tell you, to quote Yogi Berra, who was a famous American baseball player. He said, predictions are difficult, particularly about the future. And so I prefer to predict the past because the likelihood of being correct is higher. And we all know what social media has done. I think we can project that it may continue to get worse. I don't want to be negative, but I am concerned. An editor colleague of mine refers to what he calls Twitter science. Okay? And that's simply things that are packaged for social media. I know people who have less gray hair than I have, who simply say, if it doesn't get tweeted, it doesn't get read. And I know the realities, and I also know that I'm a little old-fashioned, right? I believe in peer review. I believe in publication. I believe in a lot of things, but I also am a realist to see what's happening. And I do have some concerns. We have the federal government in the United States that are publishing laws and guidelines that were written with ChatGPT with completely made-up references as a justification for the policy. This is not good. So I have concerns. Hey, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the great questions.